Rancher lived alone for years until the Bigfoot dropped a bloodstained map at his feet. It didn't growl, it didn't attack. It just dropped this at my feet. Before we begin, take a moment to share where you're listening from today. And when the story's done, I'd love to hear your rating 0 to 10. Now, settle in and enjoy. The wind came hard off the Montana ranges, cutting across the yellowed grasslands, howling through the warped boards of an old fence. Somewhere out along the trail, a harmonica's lonesome notes drifted on the air, blending with the steady thud of hooves on dry earth-red dust, curling upward with each strike. The road back to my solitary ranch lay wrapped in the cold gray of late afternoon. From the shadowed tree line in the distance, something stirred. Then it stepped into the open, taller than any man I'd ever seen, shoulders wide as a cliff face. It didn't growl, didn't charge. The only sound was the slow groan of my porch boards beneath my boots as I watched it draw closer. It stopped, and without a sound it let fall a crumpled map, its paper stiff, stained with the dark, dried traces of old blood. Then, turning without a glance, it vanished into the forest's shadow, leaving nothing but the cold bite of wind, and a silence so heavy it pressed against my ribs. That autumn, it all began with a map. Out on the Montana high plains, the hills rolled endless with dry grass, the evening wind sweeping over every blade, carrying the chill of earth and the sharp scent of pine drifting down from the distant mountains. Few ever passed through here, just a handful of drifters on horseback, some travelers pushing west, and ranchers like me, men who'd chosen to live in the company of solitude. My name's Elias Carter, 47 years old. I've been raising cattle on this land near all my life. 11 years back, I lost my wife and little girl to a sickness that tore through the town. Since then, my days had been one long echo, rising to the sound of horses snorting in the barn, working till the sun slipped behind the ridgeline, and spending the night with nothing but the lamplight for company. But that autumn, something in the forest changed. Pine branches high off the ground were snapped clean through, and tracks sank deeper than a horse's hoof in the damp soil. At first, I figured it was a grizzly, but the stride was longer, heavier, as if someone or something was drawing closer, watching from the shadows. When you live alone out here, you learn to hear the language of silence, and the silence then felt like a warning. If you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do? Part 1. The Strange Encounter. The sun was sinking behind the Absaroka Range, spilling a honey-gold light across the brittle prairie grass. The evening wind carried fine sand that scratched lightly against my cheek as I stepped out into the yard to check the north fence. Somewhere off in the distance, a gunshot cracked the stillness, maybe a hunter, or maybe some stranger gambling his luck in the timber. My Angus cattle lifted their heads from the graze ears, twitching. They were used to gunfire this time of year, but tonight the wind sounded different. Deeper, heavier, like it was pushing something closer. I made my way back toward the porch, the Winchester still propped by the door. A lifetime in the wild had taught me this much: when the silence holds too long, trouble's near. No birdsong, no insects, just the hiss of grass rubbing against itself. I turned my eyes toward the tree line and felt someone staring back. The last gold drained from the sky, replaced by a cold wash of violet gray, and then from between the pines a dark figure stepped out, tall enough that its shoulders brushed the lower boughs, broad as a barn door. It moved, slow, steady, snapping dry limbs underfoot. Instinct told me to raise the rifle, but my hand hesitated, hanging in midair. This thing didn't charge, didn't crouch to spring like a grizzly. It stood upright, eyes fixed on me. And in that fleeting light I caught them, amber eyes catching the last embers of the day like cooling coals. There was no threat in them, only study, as though it was weighing me or waiting for something. My heartbeat was slow, not from fear, but from the not knowing. The wind shifted, blowing hard out of the north, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of dried blood. I knew that smell well after shootouts in town, or when a kill was left to spoil in the open. Thunder rumbled far off, warning of a dust storm rolling in. Out on the grassland, the herd began drifting toward the barn, uneasy, lowing deep in their throats. The whole world felt strung tight like a bow pulled to the breaking point. The creature stood no more than 30 feet from me now. Its hair hung in tangled mats, its shoulders sagged under a weight I couldn't name. I thought of the sidelong looks the townsfolk gave me whenever I came in for supplies, measuring, judging, but never with this quiet sorrow I saw now. And I realized I'd been holding my breath. Thunder again. Dry leaves spun across the yard, wrapping around my boots. The thing lifted one arm, its hand twice the size of a man's fingers, long nails scored. And from that hand it let something drop, a soft thump as it hit the ground. In the dim light I saw a crumpled sheet of paper, edges torn, streaked with a deep brick red that had dried into the fibers. A map and blood. Before I could bend for it, the creature stepped back slow, never breaking its gaze. When its shadow melted into the pines, the wind rose again, flinging dust in swirls. And then, there was only me, the map, and the open yard. I picked it up. The paper was stiff with dried blood, the copper scent sharp in my nose. Faded lines and mud-smeared markings pointed north into the deep woods, where sound itself seemed to vanish. I stood there a long time, the map in my hand, listening to the wind moan along the eaves and the flagpole creak in the gusts. Questions whirled through me like a gathering storm. Why give this to me? Whose blood was this? And most of all, what waited in those woods? If you were me standing alone on a ranch with a blood-stained map handed over by a creature out of legend, what would you do? Leave your answer in the comments below. Part 2. The Dangerous Gift. The wind came tearing down off the mountains like some unseen beast, whipping yellow leaves into tight spirals across the cracked dirt yard. The last light of day broke through gaps in the gray clouds, falling in scattered shards like flecks of gold about to fade away. Out in the west pasture, the cattle grew restless. Lowing turned to panicked bawls, hooves drummed against the ground, and the fence rails rattled under their weight. Over the din came a single gunshot from somewhere beyond the fields, deep solitary, a reminder that the West never truly sleeps. I stood on the porch, the wind cutting my cheeks raw. The creature's shadow still loomed no more than 10 paces from me, planted in the middle of the open yard as if it belonged here more than I ever had. Its massive hand began to rise, fingers curling around something unseen. When it opened, that something fell, landing with the dry, brittle sound of paper once wet, now hardened like wood. I didn't have to bend to know the dark red stains weren't ink. They clung to every fold, seeping deep into the fibers. A map, edges torn, smeared with mud and ash. The wind shifted again, carrying that sharp, metallic tang of dried blood. It dragged my mind back to the old battlefield where, after the smoke cleared and the shouting died, that smell clung to the air like a weight on your chest. I looked up, meaning to speak, though I knew there'd be no answer. The creature only turned away. Without a word, it stepped back, its gaze never leaving mine. Branches cracked underfoot, but the sound was swallowed by the howl of the wind. Its shoulders tilted slightly as it walked, no rush in its stride, like one who had decided to leave without ever needing to look back. It faded into the black pines until it was nothing more than a shadow among shadows. That's when the dust storm rolled down from the north, red grit sweeping over the yard, laying a fresh coat across the map. Through the swirling haze, the sight of it vanished, but the feeling it left behind, that I'd been given something heavy, whether a charge or a curse, pressed hard against my ribs. I stepped off the porch. Dry leaves caught at my boots, their rustle like paper crumpling. The map lay still, one corner lifting in the wind, revealing a faint section of ink beneath. When I picked it up, the paper was stiff enough to snap if bent. The stains didn't just coat the surface, they'd soaked clean through. Beneath them, thin lines ran northward, pointing deep into the forest. I knew that place by rumor alone, stories told over whiskey, half-lies and half-truths of a land that swallows men whole and never lets them out. But the weight of this map and the hand that had placed it in my reach stripped away all the distance those tales once had. I stood in the yard, the map heavier than the Winchester on my shoulder. Above, clouds fled before the wind and the light dimmed to the purple of night not yet settled. This wasn't just some trinket. It was a warning. And the way it was given, It wasn't meant to frighten me off. It was meant to force a choice: go in or turn away. From the woods came a low, drawn-out cry, not wolf, not any predator I knew. The herd bellowed in response, thundering toward the barn. Everything in the air seemed to bend toward a single truth. It was time to decide. If a creature out of legend handed you a blood-stained map, would you follow it or would you leave it behind? Part 3. The Bloody Clue. My cabin was no bigger than a hay shed, but every plank in its walls held the memory of winters long past. Tonight the lamplight spilled warm across the table, my shadow stretching long over the wall. Outside, the wind howled at the window seams, rattling the panes, pushing red dust in through the cracks to settle in a thin coat on the floorboards. From somewhere far off, gunfire rolled across the dark, low, scattered a reminder that out there, other lives were still unfolding, and sometimes ending. I laid the map down on the table, breathing slow, as if afraid a single exhale might tear it apart. The scent of dried blood still clung to it, mixing with the smell of lamp oil and wood smoke, creating something sharp in my throat. The paper was so old the inked lines had faded to near nothing, leaving only thin pencil marks blurred here and there. I traced each path with my finger, noting the hasty, uneven strokes drawn not by a careful hand, but by someone racing against time. At the heart of it lay a circle deep in the northern woods. I'd heard of that place all my life, stories of men vanishing without a trace, of strange screams, splitting the night of a gold-seeking party, found only in the form of abandoned tents and a cold campfire. Along the trail leading in were scattered X marks. To a stranger, they'd mean nothing. But to a man who'd hunted these parts, I knew exactly what they were: ground with cover for an ambush, or a grave. Outside, the wind shifted its long cry, sweeping over the open range and whistling against the porch beams. In the barn, the cattle stirred hooves, scraping the damp earth. I remembered the way they'd scattered earlier today when that creature's shadow crossed the pasture, just as they would at the smell of gunpowder and human blood. I let my fingertips rest on one of the deep crimson stains. The paper was rough there, almost cold. This was more than a root, it was a message, and whoever had left it knew I'd be able to read it. The nearest town came to mind, along with the wary eyes that followed me whenever I came in for ammunition or salt. In the West, strangers were trouble by default, and even familiar faces could find themselves unwelcome if they brought bad news. I pictured walking into the saloon with this map. By the time the first whiskey glass hit the table, the truth would already be twisted. No, someone out there was holding on to a secret. And maybe that creature hadn't made it. Maybe it had only found it before I did. I folded the map and slid it into my leather coat pocket. My palm was damp, though the cabin air was warm. Two voices fought in my head. One told me to burn it and go on living as I always had. The other whispered that if I turned away, I'd never sleep easy again. I rose and looked out the window toward the tree line. The darkness there was thicker than any night I'd ever seen. And in that moment, I knew my choice wasn't born of curiosity. It came from the weight of an invisible debt placed in my hands, along with this blood-marked map. If you were in that cabin, with a map like this before you, would you step into the forest or bury it deep? Part 4. The decision to step into danger. Morning broke thin and pale dew clinging to the barbed wire fence. I shrugged into my old leather coat, Winchester slung across my back boots, pressing deep into the damp earth. Buck, my old bay, who'd carried me through more hunts and storms than I could count, snorted as I set the saddle. Far off to the south, a lone gunshot cracked the quiet. Out here, not everyone rose early to test a rifle, but in the West, it was nothing worth pausing over. I pulled my scarf up over my mouth and fixed my gaze on the northern woods. The map in my coat pocket felt like a cold coal that still held heat somewhere deep inside. Today I'd follow it. We left the ranch yard behind. Wind rose from the valley, carrying the scent of wet grass and rich earth. Each step from Buck sent dew splashing onto my trouser legs, chilling them to the skin. The dirt track narrowed the grass, closing in. Off to the left, a light dust storm spun across the open ground. Gray clouds stretched over the sky, warning of a day that would not stay calm. Somewhere ahead came the faint crunch of movement. Not deer, not any game I knew. Out of the mist, a large figure emerged. My chest tightened until the gait struck me as familiar. Bigfoot. It didn't hide, didn't break away. It walked ahead of me close enough that I could see its breath fogging in the cold air. Every so often it glanced back, amber eyes as still as a winter lake, then turned forward again. At first I thought it was coincidence, just two travelers heading the same way. But when it turned exactly where the map's trail led, I knew. It was guiding me. The thud of Buck's hooves merged with the heavy hammerfall of its steps. Between us, no words were needed. The deeper we went, the dimmer the light became. Pine boughs locked together overhead, sealing off the sky. The air grew cold and wet resin, and the faint tang of iron hanging in it making my skin prickle. Buck tossed his head, hesitating as a branch snapped somewhere out ahead. Bigfoot froze, head lifting to listen. Then it moved again, tilting its shoulders slightly as if to put itself between me and whatever had made that sound. For the first time I felt it wasn't the danger here. It was the shield. We came to a low hollow where mud and ash mingled on the ground. I looked down to see one of the X marks from the map lying directly under my boots. Bigfoot stood still, its gaze fixed northward toward a wall of forest, so dense it seemed to drink in the light. I understood without a word what lay ahead was different, and I knew standing there that I had passed the point of no return. If a creature of legend appeared to lead you into a place like this, would you trust it and follow or turn back? Part 5. The Price of Truth. As we closed in on the last mark on the map, the air shifted. The wind came crosswise, carrying a scent I knew too well, sharp and metallic, drying my throat. Blood. Fresh, heavy, laced with the damp of turned earth and rotting leaves. From somewhere distant, a gunshot cracked. Then silence, like someone had finished whatever they'd set out to do. Buck shivered beneath me, and I tightened the reins to steady him. Bigfoot stopped, its shoulders taut, scanning the shadowed timber ahead as if reading signs only it could see. I knew I was about to face something I'd spent a lifetime avoiding. We stepped into a clearing where the ground was torn up, leaves scattered over dark stains. On a fallen log, deep claw marks scored the wood as if it had been struck with a blade. Empty shell casings lay in the dirt, catching the weak light filtering through the pines. I bent to pick one up, .44-40 caliber. Not many in these parts carried that. The tracks here overlapped in chaos, men, animals, and something far larger. Bigfoot stood motionless, its gaze fixed on the black stretch of forest to the north. It didn't speak, couldn't, but I understood. Whatever happened here, it wasn't long ago. Beneath a low brush, something glinted. I knelt, pushing aside wet leaves and soil. A knife, its blade chipped, its handle carved with the letters TP. My chest tightened like a fist closing around it. Tom Pritchard. We'd driven cattle through Wyoming together, drunk whiskey under storm skies, laughed in the face of dust storms. He'd been my brother in all but blood. And 7 years ago he'd vanished without a trace. Now here was his knife lying in blood-soaked earth, less than a day's ride from my home. I gripped it hard, memory flooding in the easy grin, the way he'd throw himself between me and trouble in a saloon, the firm handshake the day we split the trail. I'd told myself he'd just gone chasing fortune somewhere else. But now, Bigfoot's eyes found mine. In them I caught something almost human, knowledge and regret. Maybe it had seen what happened. Maybe it knew what Tom had faced. But the truth was going to cost me. I stood in the clearing, the knife heavy and hot in my hand. Each gust brought the copper tang of blood stronger, reminding me I'd come too far to turn back. The map hadn't just led me to a secret. It had torn open an old wound, forcing me to stare into the space where my friend should have been. And I knew finding the answer meant losing another piece of myself. Bigfoot turned, stepping slowly deeper into the trees, as if inviting me to follow. I looked at the knife, then at its retreating shadow. The question rose in me again, heavier than before. Was I willing to pay the price if the truth meant shattering your best memories? Would you still want to know, or would you let the darkness stand? The ending night had settled by the time I rode back into the ranch yard. The cabin door groaned on its hinges, and the heat from the wood stove wrapped around me like an old blanket. I set the rifle in its rack, unwound the scarf from my neck, and pulled the map from my coat pocket. It was still cold to the touch, the surface rough where the blood had sunk deep. I folded it carefully, tucking it into the oak desk drawer, the place I kept the things no one else was meant to touch. Through the window, the northern forest stood black and unbroken, silent as a wall. But I knew the truth. Beyond that darkness, the story wasn't finished. And this time, I'd go in. Not out of curiosity, but because of the invisible debt laid in my hands the moment that map hit the dirt. Some calls don't need to be spoken. They simply wait until you answer. If a creature of legend handed you the trail to a blood-soaked mystery, would you follow it? If you were the rancher, would you stay by the fire or ride on into the wild?